The sun hung low over the Arizona desert, bleeding gold across the jagged cliffs and crimson rock. Heat shimmered in the distance, and the only movement came from a swirl of dust stirred by the hooves of Apache ponies. Their leader, Taza, rode at the head, tall, proud, and silent. His face was marked not only by the wind and war paint, but by the calm wisdom of a man who carried his people's future on his shoulders. For months, Taza's band had been hunted. Soldiers from Fort Lowell pushed deeper into Apache territory, burning camps, seizing livestock, and leaving warnings carved into canyon walls. The Apaches had fought back with guerrilla cunning, striking by night, vanishing by dawn. Yet every battle drained them. Food was scarce, ammunition scarcer, and each dawn brought the sound of more distant thunder. Horses, rifles, the white man's relentless march. That morning, as the warriors moved through the narrow pass known as Dead Horse Canyon, Taza felt the air change. The canyon walls rose high and steep on both sides, trapping the heat, muting every sound but the echo of their own hoofbeats. It was too quiet. No hawks circled. No wind whispered. Even the ponies tossed their heads uneasily. Taza raised his hand, signaling a halt. His younger brother, Kohana, looked back from the rear guard. "What is it, brother?" Taza's eyes narrowed. "Death smells like gunpowder," he murmured. He slid from his horse, crouching low, scanning the ridges above. For a heartbeat, nothing stirred. Then at a glint, a single flash of sunlight off metal, a rifle barrel. The ambush erupted in a thunderclap. Shots rained from both sides of the canyon, echoing off stone like drums of war. The Apaches scattered, returning fire from behind boulders and scrub brush. Taza shouted commands, his voice carrying above the chaos. He moved like lightning, firing, ducking, reloading. But the soldiers were too many, their positions too high. Smoke filled the canyon, thick and choking, and the horses screamed as bullets tore through them. Kohana tried to charge up the slope, but a bullet struck his shoulder, spinning him to the ground. Taza reached him, dragging him behind a fallen log. "Stay down," he shouted, pressing a hand against the bleeding wound. Kohana's breath came in sharp gasps. "Go," the younger man rasped. "Save them. Save the others." Taza hesitated only a moment before rising again, his rifle blazing. He moved toward the heart of the canyon, where the soldiers had driven them into a dead end. His band, barely 20 warriors, and was being crushed between two firing lines. He could see the officer on the ridge giving hand signals, directing the crossfire with brutal precision. Taza knew what had to be done. He grabbed a burning branch from a fallen packhorse, lifted it high, and hurled it into a patch of dry brush. Flames leapt instantly to life, sending smoke billowing upward. The wind, that fickle and fierce, carried it toward the soldiers, blinding them for precious seconds. "Now," Taza shouted. "Run for the ridge!" The Apaches surged forward, using the smoke as cover. For a moment the tide turned. They gained ground, forcing the soldiers to fall back. But just as Taza reached the far slope, a shot cracked through the haze. Pain exploded in his chest. He stumbled, clutching the wound. The world tilted. Sky, rock, flame, and faces blurred together. Kohana's voice shouted something distant and desperate, but Taza couldn't make out the words. His foot slipped on loose gravel at the cliff's edge, and before he could catch himself, the earth gave way beneath him. The fall felt endless, a spinning rush of wind, dust, and silence. He hit the rocks below with a force that drove the breath from his lungs. Darkness folded over him like a shroud. Above, the battle raged on, but the sound grew faint, as if the canyon itself swallowed it whole. The soldiers, seeing the Apache leader vanish into the depths, assumed the fight was done. The surviving warriors, scattered and bloodied, retreated into the mountains under the cover of dusk. By the time night fell, the canyon lay silent again. Smoke drifted across the moonlight, and at the bottom, half buried in dust and shadow, Taza, the proud leader of his people, lay broken and still, left for dead. The sun rose cold the next morning, pale and indifferent over the blood-stained canyon. Smoke still clung to the cliffs like ghosts of the fallen. Ravens circled lazily above, their harsh cries echoing through the emptiness. The battle was over, but the land still remembered. High above, the surviving Apaches moved silently through the brush, battered and hollow-eyed. They carried their wounded. Those who could still walk leaned on others, and those who could not were left beneath stone cairns with whispered prayers to guide them to the afterlife. Among them was Kohana, Taza's younger brother, his arm bound in a crude sling. Every few steps he would turn back toward the canyon, his heart aching with the weight of what he'd left behind. He fell, said one of the older warriors, Nantan, his voice rough from smoke. No man survives that fall. The white soldiers saw it. Even the spirits could not bring him back. But Kohana shook his head. He is our leader. The spirits will not take him so easily. The others said nothing. In war, hope was a dangerous thing. It could keep you alive or it could break you completely. And so they kept walking, melting into the hills where the soldiers would not follow. Down in the canyon, Taza still lived. The fall had left him broken, but not dead. His shoulder was shattered, his ribs cracked, his body bruised from crown to heel. Each breath stabbed through him like a knife, and every heartbeat felt borrowed. When he opened his eyes, he saw nothing but rock and sky. The sun was merciless, and his mouth felt like sandpaper. His rifle lay a few feet away, its barrel bent. Beside it, a single feather from his war bonnet fluttered weakly in the breeze. Taza tried to move, but the pain ripped through him, sharp and white. He lay still, listening to the silence. The world above had forgotten him already. The horses' hoofbeats had faded, the shouts were gone. Only the sound of wind and the occasional clatter of loose pebbles kept him company. He thought of his people, the old ones who could no longer run, the children whose laughter once echoed through the camps, his warriors who followed him without question. He thought of Kohana, brave and stubborn, who had always believed in him. A leader does not die alone in a canyon, he told himself. But the darkness pressing in at the edges of his vision whispered otherwise. By midday, the heat was unbearable. He dragged himself a few inches toward a shadow cast by an outcropping of stone. The movement cost him nearly all his strength. His lips were cracked, his tongue swollen. He found a small patch of damp earth near a trickle of water. Barely a stream, but enough to wet his fingers. He pressed the moisture to his mouth, tasting life again for the first time since the fall. As the sun sank behind the cliffs, painting the rocks red and gold, Taza's thoughts turned to his ancestors. He remembered the old songs his mother used to sing by the fire, songs of warriors who fell and rose again. A man's spirit, she would say, is not measured by how he fights, but by how he endures the silence after. That night, coyotes howled in the distance, their voices rising and falling like mourners. Taza closed his eyes, half expecting death to take him while he slept. But morning came again, harsh, bright, and alive. He was still breathing. With every hour that passed, the canyon began to change. Buzzards circled lower, testing his resolve. Ants crawled near his wounds. He was alone, truly alone, forgotten by his people, presumed dead by his enemies, left to become another nameless skeleton beneath the desert sun. And yet, something deep inside refused to yield. Perhaps it was pride, perhaps it was destiny, or perhaps it was the whisper of his mother's voice in the wind, urging him to rise. He did not know it then, but his fate had already intertwined with another's, a woman he had never met, who would soon risk her life to climb into this very canyon. For now, the Apache leader waited between life and death, forgotten by the world above, but not yet ready to surrender his soul to it. The nearest outpost of the U.S. cavalry, Fort Lowell, stood like a scar against the Arizona wilderness, its pale adobe walls glaring under the sun. Inside those walls, the air smelled of sweat, gun oil, and loneliness. The soldiers passed their days drilling, drinking, and boasting about taming the frontier. Among them lived Clara Whitfield, a woman who didn't belong to that world but had nowhere else to go. Clara was 26, a widow before her youth had even faded. Her husband, Lieutenant Henry Whitfield, had died in an Apache skirmish 2 years before, shot through the chest while leading a patrol into the same hills where the Apaches still roamed. After his death, Clara stayed on at the fort, tending to the wounded and teaching the soldiers' children their letters. The army called her the nurse, though she had no formal training. What she had was courage, and a heart that still believed in mercy. But mercy was in short supply at Fort Lowell. Every few days, a new patrol would return from the desert, sometimes with prisoners, more often with scalps or blood on their uniforms. The officers would gather in the mess hall to drink whiskey and tell stories of victory. Clara never joined them. She'd seen too much. Young soldiers crying out for mothers who would never come. Apache children brought in sick and starving, their small hands bound as if they were wild animals. She'd grown up back east in the green valleys of Virginia, where her father had taught her that all men were created equal in the eyes of God. Out here, she wasn't so sure anyone still believed that. That morning, the fort buzzed with new gossip. A major victory, the men said. An Apache war chief, fierce, clever, untouchable, had been killed in a canyon ambush. The devil named Taza was finally dead. Clara listened from the infirmary doorway as the soldiers bragged about it. Shot him clean off a cliff, one man laughed. Didn't even bother to check the body. The buzzards can finish what we started. She turned away, her stomach tight. Death never made her feel proud, not even when it came to those the army called enemies. Later, she sat on the small porch of the infirmary, looking out over the endless desert. The landscape stretched for miles, a sea of ochre and stone shimmering under the afternoon heat. Somewhere out there, she thought, men were still killing each other for land neither of them truly owned. Her friend Sergeant Collins, a grizzled veteran with more conscience than most, came by carrying a crate of supplies. You should stay inside, he told her. Sun'll boil your brains if you're not careful. Clara smiled faintly. I like to see the sky. Reminds me the world's bigger than this place. He nodded, setting down the crate. You heard about the Apache chief? Taza, they called him. Nasty one. So I've heard, she said softly. Do you believe he deserved to die? Collins hesitated. Don't reckon it's my place to say. Out here it's us or them. That's what the officers tell us. But what if that's a lie? Clara asked, almost whispering. He didn't answer. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She walked the perimeter of the fort, the stars sharp and bright above her. The desert wind carried the faint scent of rain, rare and cleansing. She stopped at the gate and stared out into the darkness beyond the torchlight. The land looked both terrifying and alive, whispering secrets she couldn't quite hear. Something inside her, a quiet, insistent pull, told her she was meant to leave the safety of those walls. Not tonight, not yet, but soon. In the distance, far beyond the fort's edge, lightning flickered over the canyon country. There, unseen beneath the cliffs, Taza still fought for life. His body broken, but his spirit unyielding. And though Clara could not have known it, her path and his were already drawing toward each other. Two lives on opposite sides of a war, destined to collide in a way that would change them both forever. 3 days after the soldiers celebrated their victory, the desert seemed to sigh under the weight of silence. The smoke of their campfires had long faded, leaving behind only the memory of gunfire and the faint, acrid smell of death carried on the wind. Clara Whitfield rode alone that morning, a basket of dried herbs and linen strips tied to her saddle. She often rode beyond the fort to gather healing plants, sage, yarrow, desert lavender, the things that grew stubbornly in this cruel land. Most of the soldiers thought she was reckless to go out by herself. Perhaps she was, but solitude was the only place she could still think freely, where the sound of her own heart wasn't drowned by orders and bugle calls. The horizon shimmered under a pale sun. Clara's mare, Maggie, moved at a steady pace, her hooves crunching against the dry earth. The wind tugged at Clara's bonnet, and sweat trickled down her back beneath her faded blue dress. She stopped near a cluster of mesquite trees, dismounted, and knelt by a patch of wild sage. As she clipped the leaves, her thoughts drifted into Henry, her late husband, to the fort's endless cycle of blood and mourning, and to that name she'd heard whispered so often of late. Taza, the Apache leader who'd defied the army for years, the man they said could vanish like smoke and strike like thunder. They called him savage, merciless, cunning, but Clara had learned not to trust the army's words. She'd seen how easily truth was twisted to fit a uniform. She packed the herbs into her basket and was about to remount when she heard it, faint and strange, carried on the wind, a sound that didn't belong. At first she thought it was an animal, the cry of a coyote perhaps. But no, it was too human, too desperate. It came again, faint but clear, a groan, broken and low, echoing from somewhere below the ridge. Clara froze. Her pulse quickened. The canyon. She walked toward the sound, pushing through brush and loose rock until she reached the edge of a narrow gorge that cut deep into the earth. The walls dropped steeply, painted in layers of red and gold. The wind funneled through it, whistling like a wounded flute. She peered over the edge, shielding her eyes from the glare. Far below, half hidden among the shadows, she saw movement, a shape that was not stone. Someone, lay sprawled at the base of the canyon. Her breath caught. She squinted, focusing. It was a man, his dark hair tangled with dust and blood, his chest rising only barely. He was alive, but only just. Clara's heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. She didn't know who he was, but instinct told her this was no ordinary wanderer. The remnants of feathers, beads, and leather near his body told their own story. An Apache. Her first instinct was to turn back, to ride for help, or at least to the fort. But she hesitated. She knew what would happen if the soldiers found him. They'd finish the job without a moment's thought, and then she remembered what the men had said at the mess table days before. Shot him clean off a cliff. Her stomach twisted. Could it be? Could this dying man be the very warrior they'd boasted about killing? The wind carried another faint moan upward. Clara looked down into the canyon again. The man's head shifted slightly, a weak, involuntary motion, proof of life. That was all it took. Something inside her, some unspoken command from her own soul made the choice for her. She turned back to her horse and began gathering what little she had. Water, rope, a strip of linen, a pouch of herbs. Her hands trembled as she worked, but her resolve hardened with each heartbeat. If I ride back, he dies, she whispered to herself. If I climb, maybe he lives. The canyon yawned before her, deep and unforgiving. The fall would kill her if she slipped, but the thought of walking away, of letting a man die alone and forgotten, felt worse. Taking a steadying breath, Clara tied the rope around a rock and tested its hold. Then, gripping it with both hands, she lowered herself over the edge. The sun blazed above. The desert wind howled in her ears. And below, waiting between life and death, lay the Apache leader she did not yet know by name, the man whose fate had just become bound to hers. The canyon loomed before Clara like the open jaws of some ancient beast. The drop stretched far deeper than she'd realized from above. Jagged rocks, thorny brush, and the shimmer of heat rising like a mirage from its floor. The figure below was motionless now, a fragile shape among stone and shadow. Clara swallowed hard. Her hands shook as she tied the rope around her waist, anchoring it to a sturdy mesquite tree at the rim. The rope was old, frayed in spots, and barely long enough to reach halfway down. If it failed, there would be no second chance. Lord, she whispered under her breath. Give me courage, or at least a steady hand. The wind rose, hot and restless. She pulled her gloves tight, looped the rope around her palms, and began her descent. At first, the world tilted gently. The rope creaked. Her boots pressed against the sandstone face, and dust filled her lungs. Each small slide downward brought a new rush of fear. Loose pebbles rattled beneath her feet, bouncing endlessly into the depths below. Halfway down, her muscles began to burn. Her bonnet slipped, tangling with her hair. Sweat stung her eyes. The smell of dust and iron filled her nostrils, mingling with the faint metallic scent of blood rising from the canyon floor. She risked a glance down, and instantly regretted it. The ground seemed impossibly far away. The man still formed tiny against the rocks. Her stomach lurched. Don't look down, she muttered to herself. Just keep moving. Hand over hand, step by step, she pressed on. Once her foot slipped on a patch of crumbling sandstone, and for one breathless second, she hung weightless in the air. A scream tore from her throat before she caught herself, the rope biting into her palms. She clenched her teeth and forced herself to keep going, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. When the rope finally ended, she found herself still 20 feet above the ground. The last stretch would have to be climbed without it. Clara took a deep breath and searched for footholds in the rock. She wedged her boot into a crevice, clung to a thorny branch for balance, and began inching her way downward. Bits of sandstone crumbled beneath her fingers, but somehow she held on. At last, her boots touched the canyon floor. Her knees gave out, and she collapsed onto the hot earth, gasping for air. For a long moment, she simply lay there, feeling the weight of her own heartbeat. Then she looked toward the figure lying a few yards away. He was still alive. Barely. His chest rose in shallow, uneven breaths. Dried blood streaked his ribs and arms, and his left shoulder was twisted at an unnatural angle. The bullet wound in his side had stopped bleeding, but the skin around it was angry and swollen. Clara crawled closer, her heart pounding. His face was half hidden beneath dust and tangled black hair. When she brushed it aside, she froze. He wasn't much older than she was, his features sharp, proud, and striking even in ruin. The strength in his jaw, the lines around his eyes. He looked nothing like the monster the soldiers had described. His eyelids fluttered, and for the briefest moment, their eyes met. Dark, fierce eyes and filled with confusion and pain. He tried to speak, but only a rasp of breath escaped his cracked lips. "Hush," Clara whispered. "Don't move. You're hurt." He didn't understand her words, but her tone softened his tension. Slowly, she reached for her canteen, tilting a few drops of water to his mouth. He swallowed weakly, his body trembling. "Easy now," she murmured, her voice steady despite the fear knotting in her chest. "You're going to live." As she tore strips from her underskirt to bandage his wounds, she felt the weight of what she'd done sink in. She was alone, far from the fort, tending to a wounded enemy in the middle of Apache country. If the soldiers found her here, they'd call her a traitor. If his people found her, they might think she'd tried to kill him. But as she worked, cleaning his wounds, cooling his fevered skin, those fears drifted to the edges of her mind. What she saw before her wasn't an enemy. It was a man, broken, human, and alive because she had chosen not to look away. When the last bandage was tied, Clara sat back, exhausted. The canyon walls glowed red with sunset light, casting long shadows over them both. Somewhere high above, the wind whispered through the rocks, a sound that might have been the desert's sigh of approval, or its warning. Either way, there was no turning back now. The desert night came quickly, pouring darkness into the canyon like ink spilling across the world. Stars bloomed overhead, bright and cold against the black. The air cooled fast, and Clara shivered, wrapping her shawl tighter as she sat beside the wounded man. A small fire flickered between them, not for warmth, but to keep away snakes and spirits. Its glow painted the canyon walls in restless shades of orange and gold. The Apache's face, lean, weathered, and fierce, softened in the light. He hadn't moved much since she'd cleaned and bandaged his wounds. His breathing was shallow but steadier now. Clara watched the slow rise and fall of his chest, listening to the whisper of the fire and the far-off cry of a coyote. She wondered what the men at Fort Lowell would say if they could see her, now sitting alone in the wilderness, with the man they'd sworn was a demon. Not a demon, she whispered to herself. Just a man. At some point, exhaustion pulled her into uneasy sleep. She dreamed of falling, down a cliff of red stone into the eyes of a stranger who never looked away. When she woke, the dawn was spreading thin light across the canyon. The fire had died to embers. She sat up, stretching the stiffness from her limbs, and then froze. The Apache was awake. He lay half-raised on one elbow, eyes open, watching her. His gaze was sharp and wary, the kind that had measured enemies before killing them. Every muscle in his battered body seemed coiled, ready to strike if he could. Clara's breath caught, but she didn't move. The two of them stared at each other, two people from opposite worlds bound together by chance and mercy. Slowly, she lifted her hands, palms open. "It's all right," she said softly. "You're safe." He said nothing, but his eyes darted around, taking in the fire, the makeshift bandages, the torn fabric of her dress. He touched his side, wincing when his fingers met the wound. Then he looked back at her with something between confusion and suspicion. Clara swallowed, forcing her voice to stay calm. "You were hurt. I found you here." He didn't understand all her words, but the tone, gentle, unthreatening, might seem to reach him. His expression eased, just a fraction. She pointed to the canteen beside her and then to him. "Water," she said, miming the act of drinking. He hesitated, watching her carefully. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, he nodded once. Clara crawled closer, every motion careful. She poured a small stream of water into a tin cup and held it to his lips. He drank greedily, the water spilling down his chin. When he finished, he leaned back, breathing heavily, his strength already fading again. "Rest," she murmured. "You need rest." He studied her for a long moment, the softness in her voice, the way her hands trembled as she spoke, the fear she tried so hard to hide. Finally, in a voice rough and deep, he spoke his first word since the fall. Why, it startled her. The question was simple but heavy with meaning. She knew what he was asking. Why help me? Why risk yourself for an enemy? Clara hesitated. "Because no one deserves to die alone," she said quietly. Not even you." He didn't answer, but his gaze lingered on her, searching for deceit. Finding none, he turned his head toward the canyon wall, eyes half closing. For a long time, neither spoke. The morning wind swept through the ravine, carrying the scent of rain and dust. Clara used the moment to tend to the fire and check his wounds again. When her fingers brushed his skin, he flinched, not from pain, but from the shock of human contact. "You can hate me later," she said gently. "For now, you need to live." He said nothing, but a faint glimmer of understanding flickered in his eyes. By afternoon, the sky turned gray with gathering clouds. Clara built a small shelter of brush and canvas to keep him dry. He watched her work, this strange woman with sunburned cheeks and eyes full of stubborn light. She was nothing like the soldiers he'd fought. She moved with kindness, not command. When she finally sat beside him again, exhausted but calm, Taza, though she did not yet know his name, spoke softly in his own tongue, a word she couldn't understand. But his tone was no longer sharp. It was a word of thanks. The first fragile bridge had been built, between healer and warrior, between two hearts divided by war but bound, now, by the will to survive. The storm came at dusk. Thunder rolled over the canyon like the growl of an angry god, and the wind whipped sand through the ravine in blinding gusts. Clara fought against it, her dress snapping around her legs as she struggled to secure the small shelter she'd built from branches and canvas. The Apache, the man she'd risked everything to save, lay weak beneath it, his eyes half open, following her every move. She could feel his gaze on her even through the roar of the wind. The rain came suddenly, fat, heavy drops that hit the earth like stones. In the desert, rain was both blessing and danger. It could heal the thirst of the land, but it could also flood the canyons without warning. Clara knew they couldn't stay where they were. "We need to move," she shouted over the wind, though she doubted he understood. She pointed toward a darker patch in the canyon wall, a hollow half hidden by brush. "Shelter." The Apache's eyes flicked in that direction, then back to her. His face was pale, but his spirit still burned in his eyes. Slowly, with great effort, he tried to push himself up. "No, don't," she started, but he ignored her. Pride and pain battled across his features as he forced himself to his knees. Clara rushed to his side, looping his arm around her shoulders. He was heavy, the heat of his fevered body seeping through her torn dress. Together they stumbled through the storm, the ground slick beneath their boots. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the canyon in an instant of blinding white. For that heartbeat of light, she saw how close the water was already rising, a thin stream winding through the rocks, swelling fast. They reached the hollow just as the downpour became a torrent. Inside, the air was cool and still. The cave stretched back farther than she'd hoped, deep enough for shelter, but small enough to feel safe. She lowered him gently against the wall, her breath coming in sharp gasps. He was shivering. His lips moved, whispering something in his own tongue. Words she didn't understand, but the tone was clear. "A prayer." "It's all right," Clara murmured, kneeling beside him. "You'll be safe here." The storm outside raged for hours. Water thundered through the canyon, carrying branches, stones, and debris past their refuge. Inside, the faint flicker of firelight painted the walls in restless amber. Clara cleaned his wounds again, replacing the soaked bandages. His fever had worsened. His skin burned under her hand, and his breath came in ragged bursts. She brewed a mixture of sage and willow bark from her satchel, coaxing him to drink. He resisted at first, then relented, his dark eyes never leaving her face. When the worst of the storm had passed, silence fell heavy over the canyon. The rain eased to a whisper. Clara leaned back against the rock wall, exhaustion pressing down on her. She studied him, the sharp lines of his cheekbones, the strength still visible in his battered frame, the small scars that told stories she would never fully know. "Who are you?" she asked softly. "What have they done to you?" He opened his eyes again, the firelight glinting in their depths. He seemed to understand her question, even if he couldn't grasp the words. Slowly, he touched his chest with trembling fingers. "Taza," he said. His voice was rough but clear. Clara repeated it under her breath, Taza, a name she knew too well from whispered conversations and soldiers' boasts. The name of the Apache leader who'd defied them all. The man they'd sworn was dead. Her heart quickened, but she didn't move. Whatever the army had called him, Rebel, savage, enemy. None of it matched the man lying before her now. "Taza," she said quietly. "I'm Clara." He studied her for a moment, then nodded, a slow, deliberate gesture. A silent acknowledgement that for now they were not enemies. Days passed. The rain gave way to sunlight and the world outside began to dry. Clara made the cave their refuge, a secret hideaway tucked between stone and silence. She gathered food from nearby brush, fetched water from a stream, and tended to Taza's wounds each morning and night. They began to speak in fragments, gestures, single words, shared understanding. When she pointed to herself and said Clara, he'd nod, repeating her name with a careful tongue. When she said water, he'd echo her softly, learning the rhythm of her language even as she tried to understand pieces of his. Sometimes she caught him watching her as she worked, curiosity flickering behind his guarded expression. And sometimes when she met his eyes, she felt an ache she couldn't name, something that felt like respect, and something more dangerous beneath it. In the heart of the desert, between stone and storm, two souls divided by war began quietly to see each other. By the 5th day, the canyon had turned quiet again. The floodwater had dried into streaks of red dust and the air smelled clean, washed free of gunpowder and grief. In the cave, the light of dawn filtered through the narrow opening, painting gold across the stone floor where Clara sat grinding herbs in a small clay bowl. Taza was healing, slowly, stubbornly. His fever had broken the night before, leaving him pale but awake. He could sit upright now, his dark eyes alert and sharp again. Every day his strength returned, like the steady rise of the desert sun. He watched Clara work, curiosity flickering behind his silence. Her hands moved with the quiet skill of someone who had seen too much pain to fear it anymore. She'd begun to hum, a soft tune from her childhood, and though he didn't know the words, it calmed him. But peace in the desert never lasted long. That morning, far above the canyon, a patrol of soldiers rode through the brush, 6 men under Sergeant Collins, their horses snorting against the heat. They were following tracks, hoofprints that led toward the ridge. Clara's horse. Collins squinted at the ground. "That's Whitfield's mare," he muttered. "Been gone near a week now." The corporal beside him spat into the dust. "Maybe the engine's got her." Collins shook his head. "No, she's too careful. If she's out here, she's looking for something." The men spread out, searching. One of them found the remains of a small campfire, cold but recent. Another spotted a strip of blue cloth caught on a mesquite branch, the same color as the dress Clara had worn. Colin's face hardened. "Mount up. We follow the trail." Down below, Clara didn't know any of this. She was teaching Taza the English word for water, laughing quietly each time he repeated it with the wrong inflection. "Water," she said, exaggerating the syllables. "Wa-ter," he echoed, and she smiled. Close enough. The sound of her laughter, light, unguarded, filled the cave. For a moment, Taza let himself forget the war waiting outside. But then his expression changed. His head lifted, eyes narrowing toward the canyon mouth. He heard something. Hoofbeats. Distant, but unmistakable. Clara followed his gaze. The faint rhythmic thud grew louder, echoing down through the stone walls. Her heart sank. Soldiers. Taza's jaw tightened. He tried to rise, wincing from the effort. "They come," he said, his voice rough. Clara stood quickly, grabbing her satchel and canteen. "You can't fight them," she said. "You're not strong enough." He met her eyes, defiance flashing there. "No run," she shook her head fiercely. "If they find you here, they'll kill you, and they'll call me mad or worse. We have to hide." He hesitated. Pride warred with reason, but the urgency in her voice, or the fear, not for herself but for him, broke through. Clara helped him to his feet and guided him toward the back of the cave where a narrow fissure split the rock. It was barely wide enough for a man to crawl through, but it led to a hollow space behind the main chamber. She'd noticed it days before when searching for dry wood. "Go," she urged, motioning toward it. He looked at her one last time, his expression unreadable. Then he crouched and disappeared into the shadows. Clara kicked sand over the fire, scattering the ashes, and wiped away any trace of the second bedroll. Her heart pounded so hard it hurt. By the time the hoofbeats reached the canyon rim, she was standing alone near the cave entrance, pretending to collect herbs. Moments later, Collins appeared above her on horseback. "Miss Whitfield," he called down. "What in blazes are you doing out here?" Clara shaded her eyes. "Gathering plants," she said, forcing a calm smile. "The storm washed most of what I had back at the fort." Collins frowned. "You shouldn't be here. We've been tracking movement. Thought it might be Apache." "Just me," she said evenly. "I've seen no one." He studied her face, suspicion clouding his weathered features. Behind him, one of the younger soldiers peered into the canyon, scanning the rocks. "If you say so, ma'am," Collins finally said. "Best head back. Command's getting jumpy. They say there's still one of them out there. Their chief, maybe. Taza, I think his name was." Clara's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her expression still. "I've heard the name," she said softly. "But he's dead, isn't he?" Collins shrugged. "That's what they say. But I've been out here long enough to know the desert don't bury its ghosts easy." With that, he tipped his hat and turned his horse. The patrol rode off, the sound of hooves fading into the wind. Clara waited until the last echo vanished before sinking to her knees, trembling with relief. From the shadows behind her, Taza emerged, silent, watchful, alive. Their eyes met, and in that moment, both understood what she had risked. For him, for something larger than loyalty or fear, something that, though neither dared name it, was already growing between them. The soldiers returned 2 days later. Clara knew the moment the peace of the canyon shifted, a silence too sharp, a bird's cry cut short mid-flight. Taza heard it too. He'd been walking without her help for the first time that morning, testing his strength by the fire. Now his head lifted, his body tensing like a bowstring. Through the canyon wind came the faint clang of metal, the jingle of bridles, the thud of boots. Voices carried across the rocks. They were back, and this time there were more of them. Clara's heart slammed in her chest. She'd prayed that Collins and his men had believed her lie, that they'd left for good, but the army was thorough. They always came back. Taza looked toward the cave mouth, eyes narrowing. "They come for me," he said, his voice low, steady. Clara nodded. "Then we can't stay." He started toward the narrow exit at the back of the cave, the one that led into a network of hidden ravines. But Clara stopped him with a hand on his arm. "Not that way," she whispered. "If they find the tracks, they'll follow." She pointed upward toward the ridge. "We go higher. The storm's building. It'll cover us." Outside, the sky was bruised with clouds. The air felt heavy, electric, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Clara grabbed her satchel, slinging it across her shoulder. Taza reached for the rifle she'd salvaged days before. Bent, battered, but functional enough to threaten. His hand brushed hers as he took it. For a heartbeat, their eyes met, an unspoken promise passing between them. Then they ran. The first drops of rain came as they climbed the canyon wall, slow at first, then faster, stinging their faces like sand. Thunder cracked overhead, shaking the ground. Behind them, shouts rang out. The soldiers had found the cave. "Go!" Clara gasped, gripping the rocks. Her skirt snagged on a branch, tearing, but she didn't stop. The world was a blur of wind, rain, and red stone. Taza moved ahead, agile despite his injuries. He turned once to help her over a ledge, his hand gripping hers tightly, the calluses rough, the warmth fierce. Lightning split the sky, throwing the world into stark relief. For one instant, Clara saw the soldiers below, torches flickering like angry stars as they spread through the canyon. Gunfire cracked. The sound echoed up the cliffs. A bullet sparked against the stone near her hand. Another whined past her ear. Taza pushed her forward, shouting something she couldn't hear over the storm. The wind howled, carrying sand and rain in sheets. They reached the top of the ridge just as the downpour turned into a full tempest. Wind tore at them, bending the sparse desert brush nearly flat. The sky raged. Thunder answering thunder, lightning splitting the heavens. Taza led her toward a cluster of boulders where the earth dipped into a shallow ravine. They ducked inside, gasping, soaked to the bone. Clara clutched her chest, trying to catch her breath. Taza knelt beside her, scanning the horizon. The soldiers' torches were still visible far below, wavering points of light swallowed slowly by the curtain of rain. "They will not follow," he said finally, his voice calm against the storm. "Not in this." Clara looked at him. The man who had once been her enemy, who now stood between her and death. "They'll keep searching," she said. "If they find us together." "They will not," he interrupted softly. "I will see to it." Lightning flashed, and for a moment their faces were close enough for her to see the reflection of the storm in his eyes. Something inside her broke open. Fear, relief, gratitude all at once. "You saved me," she whispered. Taza shook his head. "No, you saved me first." For a moment neither spoke. The rain drummed against the rocks like a heartbeat. Then, without thinking, Clara reached out and took his hand, the simplest, most human act in a world that had forgotten kindness. Taza's fingers closed around hers, rough and strong. It wasn't love, not yet. But it was something just as powerful. Trust, fragile and real, born in the heart of the storm. The wind howled louder, swallowing the last echoes of gunfire. The soldiers turned back, blinded by rain. And somewhere between thunderclaps, two souls who should have been enemies disappeared into the wild dark together, running not from war, but toward whatever future the desert would allow them. The storm passed by dawn. The desert lay reborn, washed clean, the air cool and sharp, every cactus glistening with drops of silver. Mist drifted low over the red mesas like breath from the earth itself. In the hush that followed the chaos, it was hard to believe a battle had ever touched this place. From the ridge, Clara and Taza watched the sun break over the horizon. Neither spoke. Words seemed small against such a sky that burned gold and crimson, vast and endless as freedom itself. They had walked all night, guided only by the flash of lightning and instinct. When the first light touched them, Clara felt a weight lift from her chest. For the first time since she had left the fort, she was not afraid. Taza turned toward her, his face solemn but peaceful. The storm had scrubbed the soot and blood from his skin. In the dawn light, he looked both weary and unbreakable, like the land around them. "Soldiers gone," he said simply. Clara nodded. "For now." She sank onto a flat rock, her legs trembling from exhaustion. The wind tugged at her hair, carrying the scent of wet sage and smoke. "Where will you go?" she asked quietly. Taza's gaze drifted toward the distant mountains, the sacred peaks his people called home. "North," he said. "To my people. They wait." A pang tightened in her chest. She had known this moment would come. The cave, the storm, their strange, fragile peace, all of it had been borrowed time. "You'll be safe there," she said, forcing a smile. Taza studied her. "And you?" She hesitated. "If I go back, they'll ask questions. Maybe they already suspect." "You could come," he said, the words slow, careful. Not a command, but an offering. Clara looked toward the mountains. A part of her longed to follow, to leave behind the fort, the war, the endless lies told in the name of peace. To vanish into the high country, where the air was pure and no one cared about the color of a uniform or the sound of a last name. But she knew what it would mean. The life she'd be giving up. The world that would call her traitor. She'd be hunted same as him. Her voice was soft when she finally answered. "My place is down there. Someone has to tell the truth about what's happening, about who you really are." Taza said nothing for a long time. Then he nodded once solemnly. "Then you are stronger than you think." They stood facing one another in the morning light. The silence between them was deep but not empty, full of things neither could say. Gratitude, respect, the strange, impossible tenderness that had grown between two people who should never have met. Clara reached up and pressed something into his hand, a small silver locket, dented and worn. Inside was a tiny drawing of her younger brother, who had died years before back east. "For luck," she whispered. Taza turned the locket over in his fingers, then looked at her. "I will keep it," he said. "So I remember the woman who climbed the canyon," she smiled, eyes glistening. "And I'll remember the man who survived it." They parted without a kiss, without a promise. Just a look that carried the weight of everything they couldn't have. Taza disappeared into the mist, moving north with the silent grace of a ghost. Clara watched until he was nothing but a shadow among the stones. When she finally turned back toward the plains, the sun was full over the horizon. She walked alone, but her steps were steady. Somewhere deep inside, she carried the knowledge that she had changed something. Not the war, Not the world, but one man's story, and perhaps her own. Years later, travelers crossing the Arizona wilderness would speak of a legend, of an Apache leader who vanished after a great storm, and of a white woman who was seen once, climbing the cliffs near the same canyon, her hair wild in the wind. They said the two had found one another in the storm and walked into legend together, their fates forever tangled in the red dust and desert wind. And on quiet nights, when the moon rose over the mesas and the coyotes sang to the stars, the wind carried an echo, soft, distant, like a woman's voice calling a name across the canyon. Taza,